Miguel Santos just looked like another Filipino immigrant returning home after a long workday. Hurried in the 10C seat, his janitor uniform still carried the smell of hospital cleaning products where he worked double shifts 3 years ago. At 34, he had learned to become invisible, especially on flights like this where each look carried silent judgments about his presence in premium economy class. "Sorry, but are you sure you are in the right seat?" The question came from Richard Blackwood, a 10th-seated businessman, who adjusted his Italian silk tie while watching Miguel's spent boots. "It's just, well, this is an expensive flight." Miguel just nodded silently, showing his passage. What Richard didn't know was that that ticket had cost 3 months of rigorous economy, every penny saved for this trip that meant much more than a simple return home. The flight attendant, Jessica, discreetly verified Miguel's documentation twice, as if he expected to find a mistake. "It's all right," he murmured, but his tone suggested genuine surprise. "He probably won in the lottery," Richard commented loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, tearing down his wife Jennifer's muffled giggles. "Or maybe saved a whole year for this only trip." Dr. Elena Martinez, neurosurgeon sitting on row 8, frowned as she watched the exchange. There was something in Miguel's stance, the way his eyes automatically scanned the emergency exits, as his hands remained perfectly immovable despite the initial turmoil, which resembled the military veterans he attended to his private clinic. While Boeing 777 gained altitude over the Pacific, Miguel closed his eyes and allowed the memories to flow. 11 years had passed since she had left the Philippines with a scholarship for aeronautical engineering in the United States. 11 years since he discovered that his Filipino military pilot diplomas have been considered inadequate by the U.S. authorities, forcing him to accept any available work. His family in the Philippines still believed he was a successful engineer. They never knew about the 16-hour shifts cleaning hospital bathrooms, about the nights sleeping in the car when I couldn't afford rent, how I kept every dollar to keep a promise made to the father on the deathbed. "It's amazing how some people can afford luxuries that can barely play." Richard continued his whispered conversation with his wife, but loud enough for half a plane to hear. "Completely distorted priorities. It will probably starve next month to pay for this extravagance." Jennifer nodded, agreeing. "It must be one of those people who spend the whole salary on a single experience to post on social networks. Very sad, in fact." The couple Thompson, elderly veterans of war sitting in row 9, exchanged uncomfortable looks. Harold Thompson recognized something familiar in Miguel's disciplined stillness, a calm that came from rigorous military training only. Young Sarah Kim, 12, traveling alone to find her grandmother in Manila, watched everything with the brutal honesty of children. "Why are those people being so bad with the quiet man?" he asked the flight attendant aloud. "Shh, dear," Jessica murmured, clearly embarrassed by the situation that unfolded in her section. It was then that the emergency exploded like a bomb. A deaf bang came from the command booth, followed by the emergency medical alarm. "Doctor on board! Doctor on board!" The voice of co-pilot Sarah Martinez echoed by the intercom, loaded with poorly disguised panic. "Is Captain Phillips unconscious? Is there any doctor on board? Any military or commercial pilot?" The silence that followed was sepulchral. 200 passengers looked nervously as the aircraft began to swing irregularly, as if losing control. Dr. Elena Martinez got up immediately. "I'm a neurosurgeon," he shouted, running toward the cabin. But when the pilot question echoed again by the plane, the silence was even more deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Miguel opened his eyes slowly. For an infinite moment he remained motionless, weighing a decision that would change not only the fate of that flight, but would reveal secrets that he had kept for over a decade. So, with the same calm he had used to face 1,000 other prejudices, he got up. "I'm a pilot," he simply said, his voice cutting through the growing panic like a sharp blade. Richard turned sharply, his wide eyes with unbelief. "You? A pilot? But you are—" Your phrase died when you found Miguel's gaze, a look that had seen storms that Richard could never imagine. That's he has been the deadly tranquility of those who had already flew through war zones, when survival depended on decisions made in milliseconds. At that moment, while Miguel walked determinedly towards the command booth, something in his posture changed completely. The respectful submission disappeared, replaced by an authority that made the air around it seem electrically carried. If this story of prejudice and heroism touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how a Philippine janitor was about to reveal secrets that would leave all first-class passengers questioning everything they thought about human value, courage, and the judgments we do based only on what our eyes can see. "I am a pilot," Miguel repeated, his voice cutting through the panic that was beginning to spread through the cabin as uncontrolled fire. Richard Blackwood released a nervous laugh, high enough for half the plane to hear. "Pilot? You must be kidding. Look at you, man. You clean bathrooms to make a living. Jessica's flight attendant hesitated, clearly divided between the desperate emergency in the cabin and the apparent impossibility of the situation. Lord, do you have credentials? Valid licenses? Miguel reached the inner pocket of his jacket spent and removed a faded leather wallet. From inside her emerged a document that made Jessica's eyes wide, a license of the military pilot of the Philippines, with various certifications and official stamps. Captain Miguel Santos, Air Force of the Philippines, said simply by giving him the document. Film hours of combat in F-5 Tigers, 10 years of active service. The silence that followed was so deep that the sound of the plane's engines seemed like a deafening roar. Richard examined the document over Jessica's shoulder, her face quickly moving from skepticism to total unbelief. That can't be real, Jennifer murmured, Richard's wife. He was cleaning hospital floor yesterday. Dr. Elena Martinez, who had run to the cabin, appeared at the door with a serious face. Captain Phillips had a massive heart attack. She is stable but unconscious. Co-pilot Sarah is flying alone, but she has less than 200 hours in this type of aircraft and has never faced an emergency of this magnitude. Miguel nodded with the calm of those who had faced much worse situations. Doctor, what exactly is the captain's medical status? I need to know if there is a possibility of recovery during the flight. The professional form as Miguel asked the question, using precise technical terminology, made it clear to Elena that she was talking to someone she really understood about emergency aviation. Reserved prognosis. He needs cardiac surgery as soon as we land, Elena replied. Can you really fly this aircraft? Before Miguel could answer, Richard exploded in protest. Wait, we can't hand over a plane control with 200 people to for one exactly. Harold Thompson's voice cut the air like a whip. The Vietnam veteran had risen, leaning on the back of the armchair, his fixed eyes on Richard with an intensity that made the entrepreneur back off. Complete your sentence, boy. I'm just saying we need someone qualified, Richard stamped, but his trust had completely evaporated. Miguel watched the exchange in silence, recognizing the dynamics that unfolded. It was the same one who had faced 1,000 times in the last 11 years. The automatic presumption that his current appearance and work defined his real abilities. Mr. Thompson, Miguel said, addressing the veteran. Did the Lord serve in Vietnam? 2 tours. Rescue helicopter pilot, Harold replied, his eyes shining with mutual recognition. So you know that in combat situations you don't choose your allies based on the color of the uniform or the brand of the equipment. You choose based on who can take all alive from that situation. The phrase hit Harold as a punch in the stomach. He slowly nodded, remembering missions where Philippine, Vietnamese, and Americans had risked their lives for each other, where nationality and appearance meant nothing in the face of pure competence. Sarah Martinez appeared at the cabin door, his pale face as paper. Please, someone needs to help me. We're facing severe turmoil. And I don't know if I can keep control much longer. The urgency in the voice of the co-pilot broke any remaining hesitation. Miguel moved toward the cabin with the fluidity of someone who had done this walk hundreds of times, each step revealing a confidence that brutally contrasted with his humble appearance. Wait, Richard shouted one last time. What if he is lying? And if it's just a blow desperate to make themselves important? Miguel stopped in the cabin's threshold and turned slowly. When his eyes found Richard's, there was a lethal calm that made the entrepreneur swallow hard. Mr. Blackwood, Miguel said, his low but loaded voice of an authority that came to have made life or death decisions under enemy fire. In about 15 minutes, when we are flying through a tropical storm with damaged navigation systems and a failing engine, you will find out exactly how qualified I am. The way Miguel casually mentioned problems that even the co-pilot had not yet noticed sent a shiver throughout the cabin. How could he know about systems failures if it wasn't really an experienced pilot? But what no one on that plane knew was that Miguel Santos was not just a former military driver. He was one of the few survivors of one of the most dangerous missions in the history of Philippine aviation, a rescue operation that had been classified by 2 governments and cost him not only his military career, but his faith in justice of the world. As he walked determinedly towards the controls, the secrets Miguel had kept for over a decade were about to emerge in a way that would forever transform the perception that privileged passengers had about human value, heroism, and the cruel judgments we are based only on what we can see on people's surface. Inside the command booth, Miguel found a scenario that confirmed his worst fears. Captain Phillips was unconscious, connected to emergency equipment, while Sarah Martinez fought against controls that seemed to have her life. The instruments flashed red warnings in a symphony of alarms that Miguel immediately recognized. Motor number 2 is overheating, Miguel said calmly, his eyes scanning the panels with the accuracy of someone who had flown in much worse conditions. Hydraulic pressure falling into the main system. We have approximately 12 minutes before a complete failure. Sarah turned to him, his wide eyes. How do you know this? These problems have just appeared. Because I already flew through 3 little hurricanes over the southern China Sea with much worse systems than this, Miguel replied, assuming the co-pilot seat. And because the engine vibration pattern changed 8 minutes ago, you just didn't realize why you weren't trained to listen. Through the intercom they could hear the growing agitation in the passenger cabin. Richard Blackwood was demanding to talk to Real Qualified, while other passengers were beginning to question whether a Filipino janitor could really save their lives. Sarah, Miguel said, his voice assuming the calm authority that he had commanded whole squads on combat missions. I need you to trust me completely. Let's do things that are not in any business manual, but they are the only chance we have. Dr. Elena Martinez appeared at the cabin door. Captain Santos, there is something I need to tell you. I was able to talk about my colleague at the Honolulu Medical Center. He said you were known there. That saved a medical team during a hurricane 5 years ago. Miguel nodded briefly. Dr. Rodriguez, good man, I hope he's fine. He told me about Operation Bayanihan. Elena continued, her low voice. He said that you flew alone through the eye of the Haiyan typhoon to rescue 47 people from a hospital collapse, when all the other riders said it was impossible. Sarah felt a shiver traveling her spine. Operation Bayanihan had been legend among rescue pilots, a mission that had challenged all laws of physics and common sense by a Philippine pilot who later simply disappeared from official records. You are Tacaban's ghost, Sarah murmured, using the nickname that American rescue pilots had given the mysterious Philippine aviator. That name was in the past, Miguel said simply, but Harold Thompson, who had managed to approach the cabin door despite the crew protests, heard the conversation. My God, Harold whispered, I read about you. It saved more lives in a single operation than whole squads in a year. The information spread through the cabin as fire. The Filipino janitor that Richard Blackwood had despised was actually a living legend of rescue aviation, a man who had risked everything to save strangers and then mysteriously disappeared from the international scene. Why didn't you tell us? Asked Jennifer Blackwood, the initial arrogance replaced by something that seemed genuine shame. Miguel adjusted the controls with precise movements, his fingers dancing over instruments that seemed to respond to his will. Because he roles do not need recognition to do the right thing, and because I learned that people judge first, they ask later. Richard Blackwood had been in sepulchral silence, watching the cabin window as Miguel performed maneuvers that seemed impossible. The man he had despised for wearing a caretaker uniform was literally rewriting the laws of aerodynamics before his eyes. My hours, Dr. Elena murmured, watching the instruments. You're flying this plane like a fighter. Because in essence, this is what I am doing, Miguel replied, starting a descent that made all passengers cling to the seats. Combat rescue doesn't follow business rules. We just follow one rule. Everyone comes home. Sarah watched, fascinated how Miguel had transformed an impossible situation into something controllable. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, born of years flying under conditions that would have destroyed less experienced pilots. Captain Santos, Sarah said formally, assuming command as an official co-pilot of this aircraft. Your orders, sir. The moment Sarah formally transferred the command was witnessed by dozens of passengers through the open door of the cabin. The contrast was surreal. The man who had deemed unable to pay for their own ticket now commanded their lives with a competence that bordered the supernatural. But what none of the passengers knew was that Miguel Santos had not simply missing the official records after Operation Bayanihan. He had been forced to leave the Philippines after discovering a conspiracy of corruption that reached the highest level of government, a discovery that had cost his career, his identity, and almost his life. During the last 11 years, while cleaning hospital toilets during the day, Miguel had secretly worked with international humanitarian organizations, using fake identities to ride rescue missions in war zones around the world. Their superiors at the hospital never knew that their night caretaker was responsible for saving hundreds of lives in operations that never reached headlines. While the Boeing 777 cut through the clouds in a trajectory that challenged all known trade protocols, passengers finally began to understand that they had judged not only a man, but a living legend that had chosen anonymity as a way of continuing to serve humanity. And Richard Blackwood, watching the cabin window, realized with increasing horror that he had spent 2 hours trying to publicly humiliate someone who had probably saved more lives than he would ever touch in his entire existence, someone whose humility was so deep that he preferred to be despised to reveal the magnitude of his sacrifices for humanity. What happened below challenged all the laws of physics and commercial aviation that Richard Blackwood thought he knew. Miguel executed a maneuver that made Boeing 777 behave like a military fighter. Diving through a layer of clouds that air traffic controllers had declared impassable, the plane cut through the storm with accuracy that even left Sarah Martinez speechless. Impossible, Richard muttered, clinging to the seat as he watched through the cabin window. This is physically impossible for a commercial aircraft. Miguel did not respond, was too busy saving 200 lives through techniques that he had learned by flying through war zones where he was making mistakes meant instant death. His fingers danced on the controls with a fluidity that made Dr. Elena realize that she was witnessing something beyond mere competence. It was pure handicraft. "Captain Santos," Sarah said through the intercom, "Manila International Airport is denying us permission to land. They say our credentials are under investigation." Miguel smiled for the first time since he had taken controls. "Sarah, connect me directly with Manila's command tower. Use the Delta 7 Alpha emergency code." "Sir, this code does not exist in our commercial manuals." "Because it is not a commercial code." When the connection was established, Miguel spoke in Tagalog with an authority that made several Philippine passengers enter with a growing surprise. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but the result was immediate. "Flight 247, you are authorized for priority landing on the Alpha 1 military track," came the response in English. "Colonel Santos, it is an honor to have you back home." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Richard Blackwood felt as if the floor was disappeared under his feet. "Colonel," he whispered, more to himself than for anyone. Dr. Elena, who had remained in the cabin throughout the descent, looked at Miguel with an expression of total unbelief. "You are not just a former military driver. You are Colonel Miguel Santos, commander of the 5th Philippine Combat Rescue Squadron," Miguel added, concentrated on the instruments while guiding the aircraft for a landing that would be studied in aviation gyms for the next 10 years. Compulsory retired after Operation Bayanihan due to, political reasons. Harold Thompson, who had managed to approach the cabin door despite the protests of the crew, shook his head slowly. "My God, you didn't disappear after the operation. You were exiled." Miguel nodded briefly. "The Philippine government needed a scapegoat after I found out who was selling military information to foreign corporations. It was easier to make me disappear than facing the corruption that went to the top." Richard watched the conversation with a growing sense of horror about his own actions. For 2 hours, he had tried to publicly humiliate a war hero, a man who had sacrificed his military career to expose government corruption and then chose the voluntary exile to protect his family. "That's why you work as a janitor," Dr. Elena murmured, the pieces finally fitting. "Not for lack of qualification, but because when you expose the truth about powerful people, they make sure you never fly officially again," Miguel completed, starting the final approach to Manila. "But they can't get knowledge, experience, or the ability to save lives from you when necessary." The landing was perfect, so soft that several passengers applauded spontaneously. When the wheels played the asphalt, Miguel finally relaxed in the controls for the first time in 3 hours. Through the windows, they could see a F-16 Philippine formation forming a save of honor, a military tribute rarely seen for civil aircraft. On the track, a military guard of honor was waiting for the ambulances and fire trucks. "Colonel Santos," the voice of Manila, crackles control through the radio. "In the name of the Republic of the Philippines and the 200 souls that the Lord brought safely home, thanks for his continuous service to humanity." Richard Blackwood observed all this with a mixture of shame and admiration that made him physically sick. The man whose qualifications he had questioned, whose presence on the flight had considered inappropriate, had just been greeted as a national hero for an entire country. While the passengers were starting to land, many stopped to thank Miguel in person, but it was Sarah Kim, the 12-year-old girl, who said something that silenced the entire cabin. "Mr. Miguel," she said in hesitant English, "my grandmother always said that true heroes are those who help others even when no one is looking. Thank you for proving that she was right." Miguel knelt down to stay at the girl's time. "Sarah, your grandmother is a very wise woman. Always remember, the value of a person is not measured by what she has, but for what she is willing to sacrifice for others." Richard remained in his seat long after all the other passengers landed, watching the window as Miguel was escorted by Philippine military officers through an honor corridor formed by continent soldiers. Jennifer, his wife, gently touched his arm. "Richard, are you okay?" "No," he answered honestly for the first time in years. "I'm not at all well." Richard Blackwood had spent his whole life believing that financial success was equivalent to human value, what external appearance reflected internal competence, that his judgment on people based on social status was naturally superior. In 3 hours, a Filipino caretaker had completely destroyed this philosophy of life, not through confrontation or revenge, but simply being who really was when the world needed it. And the devastating part was that Miguel Santos had never tried to take revenge or humiliate Richard. He had simply saved everyone's life on board, including the life of the man who had spent hours trying to destroy his dignity, with the same professional dedication and personal grace that would apply to any emergency situation. This achievement has hit Richard as a lightning. True greatness does not have to defend itself with the smallness of others. It simply shines with its own light, and in this brilliance, all meanness reveals itself by what it really is. 6 months after the miracle landing in Manila, Richard Blackwood was sitting alone in his Manhattan office, surrounded by cardboard boxes and a team of lawyers discussing the terms of his personal bankruptcy. The fall had been dizzying and relentless. The video of the flight, secretly recorded by passengers and leaked on social networks, had shown to the whole world as a millionaire entrepreneur had tried to publicly humiliate a hero in war that eventually saved everyone's life on board. The contrast between Richard's arrogance and Miguel's silent dignity had become viral instantly. "Mr. Blackwood," said his lawyer Dr. Peterson, "the Colonel Santos Anonymous Heroes Foundation offered to buy its assets at 30% of the market value. It is the best offer we will receive." Richard laughed bitterly. Even in bankruptcy, Miguel Santos was offering help, not for revenge, but because his foundation really helped entrepreneurs in financial difficulties rebuild their lives through honest and humble work. The business world had turned against Richard with a ferocity that he had never imagined possible. Customers canceled contracts, investors withdrawn funds, and administrative councils removed it from all positions. American society had decided that it would no longer tolerate executives that humiliated people based on social class or origin. Jennifer had requested divorce 2 weeks after the flight, taking half of the remaining assets and a public statement in which she repudiated years of silent complicity with unacceptable prejudiced behaviors. Meanwhile, Miguel Santos had become a global phenomenon. The Heroes Anonymous Foundation, created with spontaneous donations from people around the world, had already trained more than 200 immigrants as commercial pilots, offering opportunities for people whose qualifications were ignored due to systematic prejudices. Richard opened his laptop and watched the video that had destroyed his life again. The part that tormented him most was not the insults he had given, but the moment when Miguel, after saving 200 lives, had kneeling to talk to the girl Sarah Kim about heroes that no one recognizes. An email arrived in your inbox. It was from Miguel Santos. "Mr. Blackwood, I learned that you are facing difficulties. Our foundation offers professional reintegration programs for executives who want to start over with purpose. The program includes volunteer work in needy communities where you can learn about real people facing real challenges. If you are interested in finding out who you really can be when you remove the masks from privilege, I'll be here. With respect, Miguel." Richard closed the laptop and looked through his office window on the 40th floor, the same one where he had looked with a disdain for smaller people for so many years. Now, facing the prospect of starting from scratch at 52, he finally understood that he had spent decades confusing financial success with human value. Dr. Elena Martinez had become a medical co-director of the Heroes Anonymous Foundation, offering free health care for immigrants. Harold Thompson used his military pension to finance scholarships for young people from needy aviation communities. Sarah Kim, now 13, had created a school club called Invisible Heroes that raised funds for essential workers. Each life touched by Miguel on that flight had become, not through revenge, but through the example of how to react to injustice with dignity and purpose. Co-pilot Sarah Martinez had received promotion to captain and now commanded international flights, carrying with it the lesson that competence has no nationality, social class, or external appearance. She kept a picture of the moment when Miguel took over the controls, remembering daily that true leadership comes at times when everything seems lost. Miguel Santos never needed to take revenge on Richard Blackwood. The world did this for it, demonstrating that in an age of social networks and growing social conscience, public prejudice has devastating consequences for those who practice it. The most powerful lesson did not come from the fall of Richard, but from the rise of Miguel, proving that when you dedicate your life to serve others, the universe conspires to reward your generosity in ways that transcend any personal revenge. Richard Blackwood has learned as painful as possible that the true human value is not measured by bank or social status, but for the willingness to use their skills to raise others, especially when no one is looking and no one will applaud. Miguel Santos had won the most important battle of all. He turned prejudice into purpose, humiliation into humility, and proved that the best revenge against human smallness is simply to be extraordinarily great in character, competence, and compassion. And Richard, looking at Miguel's email for the third time, realized that perhaps it was not too late to learn what it really means to be a man of value. not by the richness he accumulates, but by the positive difference he can make in the lives of people the world taught to despise, but who have treasures of dignity that no money put to buy. If this story of transformation and second chances has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true character reveals itself when we have everything, but when we lose everything, and find out who we really are under the masks that society teaches us to use.